You know, after almost a decade and an industry transformed, I think it's time. I think it's time that we actually looked at Demon's Souls for what it is, rather than what it created. There's no denying that the game led to an entirely new mindset of design that's so much more nuanced than before. Demon's Souls was a major catalyst for revolution in game design. Previously, it genuinely felt like a lot of decisions in games were partially arbitrary. People like fast melee combat systems, so why don't we create a massive combo list for our action game? Cinematic moments are the bread and butter of design these days, so how about every enemy is killed in a sort of cinematic finisher move where you hit timed button presses? It's not that design wasn't thought out, but more so that design rarely seemed thought out from multiple perspectives. Designers understood how certain decisions could support their design goals, but I'm not so sure that they often tried to quantify the restrictions that placed on other planned elements, or the detrimental effects those choices might have had on other systems, or at least not nearly to the degree they do now. As such, games before the Souls formula took off in the design space are almost always full of clashing puzzle pieces. If you line them all up perfectly and sit in just the right spot, you can see the picture they were trying to piece together. But the second you move just a bit, you realize the pieces aren't actually fitting together as a cohesive whole. They aren't locked in their intended spots, but instead piled on top of each other to sort of force a coherent picture into existence, even if it's not the correct one. I will never attempt to take that away from Demon's Souls, and I respect it for its bold decisions. Most of my favorite games of the last decade were directly influenced by Demon's Souls, because its influence has been all but exclusively positive, on the industry anyway. But those bold decisions were huge risks, and risks don't always pan out. So after not playing Demon's Souls all the way through for a few years, I decided I wanted to go back to it. I wanted to put my admiration for it aside, and see if all the magic I felt originally was truly due to the godly design we believe it's drowning in, or if its fresh take on design philosophy was so blinding that we were actually the ones drowning all along. Spoiler alert, a lot of Demon's Souls design doesn't really hold up. Go ahead, get the get good comments out now. Do it so that we can move into actual design talk like adults. Done? Good. Moving on. So what is it that Demon's Souls struggles to get right, and why? Well, the biggest hurdle Demon's Souls had to overcome was reconciling the risks and fresh ground it was treading with the mechanical fairness and feeling of accomplishment it wanted to instill in players. Demon's Souls was designed with the goal of getting players to feel satisfied when they conquered a challenge. As many have explained before, Hidetaka Miyazaki wanted to make a game that made players feel accomplished. He didn't want to just make a hard game. To this end, on a granular level, Demon's Souls genuinely succeeds in at least laying the vital groundwork of a good set of systems. Control is consistent in most areas, and when performance holds up, the game is responsive. Most hitboxes are accurate enough when it counts, it's rare that individual enemies feel too powerful or too weak, and most of their combat options test you well. In theory. It's the execution beyond that which often falters. For every situation in Demon's Souls that feels well thought out and engaging, there always seems to be one that genuinely just feels like the intention is to poke at players and call them stupid. Again, this wasn't actually the point according to Miyazaki, so we have to chalk the issues up to certain encounters and design choices not being given enough time in the oven. Before we dive too far into specific issues though, let's discuss a few base level problems Demon's Souls exhibits in its raw mechanics. For anyone who's played another Souls game post DS1, one of the first issues you might notice deals with the dodge roll and its implementation. Starting in Dark Souls 2, dodge rolling was an analog affair. Your character would dodge in the exact direction you pointed your stick when you pressed the dodge button. But in Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1, the roll is restricted to the 4 cardinal directions. This not only lacks precision, but also leaves some of the control precision up to the game itself. When you're holding the stick diagonally down and left, it's kind of up in the air which direction the roll will go. You roll a lot in Demon Souls. A lot. So there's always a chance that you'll have angled the stick just a bit too far in one direction and roll somewhere you don't want to go. With all of the objects you can get stuck on, and this game's obsession with bottomless pits, it's not exactly uncommon to roll yourself into a compromising position. Or, you know, straight to death. Meanwhile, the game gives players a few combat options that straight up get in the way far more often than they help. These primarily include the backdash attack and the push. The push can be useful, since while it doesn't do any damage, it knocks enemies out of blocking and staggers them for a moment. And the backdash attack can technically save you from enemy attacks, while still getting some damage off. But because they're so easy to perform on accident, they become a much more constant nuisance than anything else. Not enough enemies have shields or defensive maneuvers for the push to be widely applicable, and it's almost always smarter to do an actual dodge and then an attack instead of using the backdash attack. The lock-on itself doesn't always help make players feel in control either. Just like other Souls titles, the player locks on with the R3 button and can change targets by flicking the stick in the direction of your new target. It can also be set to auto-target new enemies in range after you kill the one you're currently locked onto. Problem is, the camera seems to whip around so much more violently than in later games when it changes targets. As the camera moves, the directional movement on the left stick moves with it, sometimes leading to falling off ledges or opening your back up to enemy hits, which are considered extremely powerful critical hits at that point. Not to mention, the camera just seems to look down at the ground a lot of the time when locked on, making obstacle avoidance difficult, as seen with the chairs in this boss room. It also collides with objects in ways that don't sit well with me, and fights as hard as it can to move back to a more favorable position, yanking control away. Continuing the trend of good ideas that aren't polished to the extent they should be, the input buffer system is a little too active in Demon Souls compared to later games. As a way to allow for less twitchy players to adequately utilize the combat system in Demon Souls, actions can be buffered by pressing them early. If you're currently stuck in an attack animation, but you know you'll need to dodge the moment it's finished, you can hit the dodge button early and your character will execute the action as soon as they can. This means you don't have to perfectly time every dodge as soon as other actions end, or risk the action not coming out. Problem is, the system sometimes doesn't work, but much more often it works too well. Actions are left in the buffer for an eternity, even if you no longer want to do them. But even worse, sometimes it chooses not to overwrite said actions with others you do after that. If you press attack again while already in an attack, and then decide you want to dodge instead, sometimes it'll attack anyway, despite you mashing the dodge button. Sometimes it won't. It's inconsistent. On the plus side, this really does force players to unlearn the habit of constantly mashing actions, which we all learned from other similar games. But unless you're really warmed up to Demon Souls systems, even just moving from other Souls games to this clearly illustrates how imprecise and rough the system is. The performance, though, that's easily one of the worst parts of Demon Souls, and puts most of the above to shame. The amount of times I died in this game because it just didn't respond while I was trying to heal, didn't respond while I was switching items or weapons, or trying to go through the final fog gate, wasting me 40 seconds of 2 elevator rides, it's unacceptable. And again, don't give me that get good shit. I've beat this game plenty of times before, and not then, not now, not ever is awful performance like this frame rate acceptable in such a precise and demanding game. It can often dip down to what feels like sub 20 FPS, and on rare occasions clearly dives into single digits. Problem is, when this happens, it's a toss-up as to whether any of your inputs will register. And it can happen in all sorts of scenarios, even against the final boss if your camera gets too close to the alpha effects for his magic-based attacks. I also take umbrage with the healing system's design in Demon's Souls. Healing in Demon's Souls is done entirely through consumable healing grass. Run out of consumables, and you're required to grind for souls or dropped grass. In the end, it eventually becomes a non-issue because the cost of buying grass is pretty low compared to the amount of souls you can farm in just a few minutes. But still, the fact that you can end up being required to grind for souls if you die to a boss too many times just doesn't feel great. It's a system the series has completely fixed in later titles, only to break it again in other later titles. It's not awful in Demon's Souls once you gain some experience, but until then, newer players are likely to have a huge problem that potentially requires hours of grinding. Most people just restart at that point. The final issue I really take with the core systems is the implementation of a carry weight system. As with minigames, you can only carry so much stuff on your person before you can't pick anything else up. My main problem here is that it doesn't really work with the loot system. If you try to pick up a treasure but it's too heavy, you're now forced to make a decision. You can either drop something else which will disappear when you leave the level, or you can accept that the loot you may have just tried really hard to get will disappear. And since you don't know what an item is going to be until you try to pick it up, you have no idea how heavy it'll be. Sometimes you're expected to pick up an entire armor set in one go. Like, who that isn't burying their character stats and vitality will be able to pick up the whole brushwood set if they weren't expecting the set to be that heavy when they interacted with the treasure? Most characters would likely have to come in with almost no supplies just to keep the whole set, and that's assuming you know how heavy it'll be beforehand. Since you won't know this on your first try, well, too bad. Drop all of your other important stuff or enjoy not getting your reward for changing the world tendency and fighting your way here. I know you can get the Ring of Herculean Strength to help with this sort of thing really early on, but the method to get it is easily missable if you're new, so it shouldn't be required. Not to mention, it scales with your current carry burden based on percentage, so having low vitality will mean the ring has little effect anyway. The common thread with all of these problems listed above is that none of them really seem fleshed out to the point that they need to be. They all step over the line of unfair, not because of the way they're designed necessarily, or the idea itself, but rather the fact that the core issue with all of them is that it takes control and choice out of the player's hands. You can't make a clear decision if you're not sure your dodge will come out because the frame rate is in the single digits. You can't make a decision about what to leave behind if you don't know that the brushwood set is something you have to pick up all at once or risk leaving behind. As such, it's hard to feel accomplished when sometimes both successes and failures feel out of your control. Now, on to more specific examples of poor design, which honestly mostly relates to questionable, extremely punishing, or even just plain unfair encounter and level design. One of the core aspects to a Souls game that makes it work so well is how diverse encounters can be while still being fair for nearly any build you can come up with, within reason. As long as you're not spreading yourself extremely thin or choosing a character build that's clearly designed extraordinarily poorly, you can conquer everything in a well-made Souls title in any way you choose. Some options will make certain encounters more difficult, but they'll also balance other encounters in your favor, making them easier. It's almost like a roller coaster of automated pacing, based on what encounters come up later. There are two types of mechanics in Demon's Souls, which I like to call universal mechanics and optional mechanics. Universal mechanics are ones that every player will have access to and therefore can freely be woven into any and all encounters. Every character, for example, has the ability to avoid damage in one way or another, using the dodge. So it's fair to test any and all players on their ability to dodge. It's important to balance this, of course, so that players using the slowest roll can still manage, but it's still fair design because every normal, sane build can roll. An optional mechanic would be something like using bows. Not all characters will have a bow. Not all characters can use a bow. So forcing players to use a bow is antithetical to the design of the game and the freedom you give players in character creation. Now, they can make it so that a character with a bow will have an easier time with an area, but the important thing is to not make it so difficult for everyone else that they feel forced into playing a different way. As the first game in the series, it's not surprising that Demon's Souls struggles with this concept. I won't necessarily say that the game ever outright requires a player to play in a specific way, but the punishment for not playing in certain ways can often be so brutal that it really does begin to feel like the game is laughing at your expense. I wouldn't call a lot of the design in Demon's Souls encounters and levels fair either. Again, not because you can't accomplish basically everything required to beat the game with every class you can throw at it, but rather because it becomes such a tedious and highly punishing experience if you try to go your own way that the game sometimes feels like it has betrayed your trust. When the game asks you to make permanent decisions related to what kind of character you're going to play as, and then gives you dozens of vastly divergent choices, you as the player are placing your trust in the systems provided to give you an engaging experience regardless of those choices. Something that in some ways tests your character's weaknesses, and in some ways suits your character's strengths. When a game ceases to do this, it's broken that trust, and can lead to players questioning why they were given choices in the first place. The idea of freedom and the skills the game wants to test you on become incompatible. Things don't actually have to be impossible to be rendered unfair in this regard, which I think is important to acknowledge, because far too many people assume that's the case. It's really no different than the opposite. Just because a speedrunner can become extraordinarily good at something that's unfair does not suddenly mean it's not unfair. And just because you're extraordinarily bad at something that's technically possible does not mean it is fair. Keep in mind that I'm not saying everything I detail below is unfair in the traditional sense, but a lot of the time the punishments don't match the mistakes. How do I explain this? It's like I can make many rather serious mistakes against something like the Penetrator boss, who is the second to last boss, but as long as I play intelligently after the mistake, I can make up for it. And yet, if I accidentally dodge at the wrong moment, I can be pushed straight to my death by a regular old enemy at the very end of a level. Or even worse, I can accidentally try moving as soon as something like a gargoyle enemy just so happens to dash behind me, meaning the lock-on changes my movement controls and the camera rotates to follow him, and I yet again fall to my death, through no fault of my own. Either way, it feels inconsistent, and the punishments are ill-befitting of my actions. Part of the problem in that case is often down to the mechanical design not being precise enough, but another part of the problem is that they chose to put bottomless pits everywhere. There is a place for enormous punishments that effectively read as instant kills, but they have to fit the mistake. And one more note before we actually get into it, it's important to keep perspectives in mind. One cannot simply say, well, if you do this, and this, and this, it becomes easy. It's vital that we reflect regularly on what knowledge we may have absorbed to the point of it being subconsciously natural to us, so much so that we won't realize when newer players don't know or understand it. Sometimes things that seem obvious often come from deeply rooted knowledge gained after years of experience. It doesn't always have to come down to obvious knowledge, like that heavier shields consume less stamina when hit than lighter shields. Our knowledge can become much more granular than this, like knowing exactly where enemy aggro ranges lie, what path they'll take to you, exactly when to roll to avoid their attacks, which side to roll to in order to get a good backstab, etc. So we need to be extra careful if we're to discount someone's struggles by saying they didn't get good enough. Sometimes it is their fault, and other times we've absorbed mountains of tiny snippets of information through experience, which translates to entirely different understandings of the systems on a fundamental level. So with that in mind, let's run through all of the larger moments that I felt crossed the line to a degree. Sometimes it's due to the less polished mechanics we discussed earlier, and sometimes it's due to the game refusing to let me make my own choices, but it always led me to an experience I didn't really enjoy, nor did I think was particularly well balanced. So why don't we start with the first real problem I had and go from there. Valley of Defilement 1 is the worst executed level in the series. It's a level that has a huge amount of potential, and there are things to like too, but the vast majority of its challenge comes not from the intentional design, but instead from the unintentional incompatibility between it and the mechanics. It can be a huge roadblock even for experienced players. To begin, I'm not sure how this issue is created, but for some reason I had a problem with attacks just whiffing against the basic grunt enemies here. It wasn't really a problem in the rest of the valley, and it happened even when the performance was fine. I think it might have just been a mismatch between the weapon I was using and the hitboxes on the enemies, but still, it's probably something that should be tightened up, seeing as you never know when somebody's gonna come in with that weapon. The rats, though, they're rage-inducing to hit with a lot of weapons, since they're so small and low to the ground. This is only a fair challenge for melee characters if you realize that not locking on and angling the camera downward will make your character attack toward the ground. Again, the hitboxes still don't cooperate well with some weapons, but it's at least doable. But this goes against what the game has taught you up to this point, and it doesn't really do a good job of pushing you in the right direction either. Why would anybody without the required experience understand that not locking on makes it easier to hit enemies that are low to the ground? This is something that's so infrequently used in the series that I forgot it was even a thing here, and I had to re-remember it. Collision on some enemies stays up for quite a while after death in many cases in Demon's Souls as well. This isn't usually an issue, but it's the crux of many traps in the valley. I don't think it's exactly fair to make the main challenge of something like this bridge here to be the fact that you can't run through enemies you just killed, and therefore get hit from behind. It's not that this is particularly difficult to deal with if you keep your wits about you. It's more so that this is artificial difficulty brought on by the developers misusing unintentional quirks in the design, rather than a challenge that's mechanically or strategically driven. The bigger grunts in this area have enormous hitboxes on their attacks meanwhile. It's pretty easy to be clipped by them. If you do, even while holding a tower shield, they'll likely consume most if not all of your stamina. And if you actually take the hit, it'll do a lot of damage and knock you to the ground. Being knocked to the ground in Demon's Souls is a pretty big deal, because you can't cancel the wake-up animation with a roll like in later titles. You have to wait for your character to stand all the way back up, all while they're completely vulnerable. These enemies can stun-lock you to death really easily thanks to this. Not to mention, these enemies are placed in sections where your only options are to either stay on narrow walkways or bridges where you can't dodge competently, or rooms so small and cluttered that the camera freaks out and basically guarantees you a death. And that's on top of the fact that they also have other enemies nearby ready to gang up on you. Asking me to deal with stuff like the awful cameras or incompatible animation rhythms as the main challenge of an enemy is not a get good situation. The game is fighting me at that point, and not allowing me to play the way it's intended to be played. To rub salt in the wound, the souls you get from enemies here are almost non-existent, meaning the stage is a massive resource eater. Because of the way things are structured, the lock-on often locks onto the wrong enemies too, which can have fatal consequences. And they love to put enemies at the bottom of drops and ladders, practically forcing you to take hits unless you get lucky, because the ladder animations are so slow. Seriously though, the camera is the biggest issue here. I guarantee you it's responsible for the majority of deaths in this stage, which is just unacceptable. The second area in the valley is much more fair most of the time, though I'm not so sure that the punishment for trying to roll in the swamp is fair. Since you're not allowed to roll, your character will try to roll, fail, and then struggle to rebalance for a second. You're completely open during this, and I've had it happen while I'm trying to sprint, and then change my mind to put my shield up or whatever, which feels like an unintentional consequence of systems overlapping incorrectly. There is one optional encounter here though that I definitely feel steps into the realm of way too difficult for some builds. This isn't the only example, but it's probably the most glaring. What is someone supposed to do without either powerful magic or a weapon that has long staggers and range that can kill these guys before your stamina runs out? Unless you're a god, there are only maybe a small handful of build types that can deal with this, which again is antithetical to the design goals of the rest of the game. The first archdemon I faced was the Dragon God. Dragon God has a lot of detractors, because it's more of a puzzle than a boss, and yet it's featured both in the start screen cutscene and if you kill the Vanguard in the beginning. So it is indeed a bit strange that he's not really a boss in the traditional sense. However, I don't think the fact that he's not an actual fight is the problem here. The real problem with him is his one-hit kills. I never understood why people complained about this before. I always thought, sure, his attacks nearly always kill you if you get hit, but they rarely ever connect. This was because, no joke, for my first 4 playthroughs, I died maybe twice across all of them combined. I got so lucky that he gave me the impression that he'd only really hit you if you played incredibly foolishly or got incredibly unlucky. This is not the case. This time I probably died around 15 times at least. His attacks before you fire the first arrow are mostly predictable, but his fire breath later is not. The biggest issue is that certain parts of certain attacks come really fast, and even worse, you can't make a break for it and look at him to dodge properly as well. Yes, once again, the camera is your main enemy here, because in order to escape his attacks, you can't look to see where he's about to land his attacks. So it really does come down to dumb luck, or absolute memorization of exactly where to stand when to bait out specific attacks consistently. Again, something that would be easier to learn if it wasn't almost always a one-hit kill and a 30-second reset to get back to where you were. The next section I struggled with was Latria 2. The stage was fair enough, even though by this point I was already getting tired of bottomless pits being one of the main threats. Seriously, this game is absolutely full of one-hit kills, usually through pits. This means the stakes can feel a bit too high because it's rarely the challenge you're up against that kills you. Rather, you usually die to a pit by proxy of facing said challenge. No, the major issue I had with Latria 2 only came into play once I got to the point where I needed to challenge the man-eaters. Never should forced encounters with extremely strong enemies who are only easily defeated with magic be placed on narrow walkways above instant death. It's bull. This Black Phantom Mind Flare is a brutal choice. Again, not because he's that difficult, but rather because he's set on such a narrow staircase where one false step is a death. The player is forced to deal with him every time, and failure means making the trek again. As I've said already, why is instant death the main risk in the run-up to the boss? I'm fine with a challenge being set before the boss. Heck, the run-up to the old monk is basically the same thing but with more enemies, but it's significantly more bearable to repeat simply because there are walls instead of pits surrounding you. The man-eaters themselves suck too for this very same reason. The main challenge is not falling off the edge, and the fact that you're likely going to be fighting both man-eaters at once, since they love to fly away where you can't really damage them, but the appearance of the second man-eater is time-based, yeah, I don't really enjoy that. The camera loves to whip around when they dash or fly, which can once again alter your movement controls and cause you to accidentally step off the edge, through no fault of your own. They also have a few attacks that come out too quickly after you've already been hit, similar to the big guys in the valley, meaning stun locking is an issue at points. Making it yet more of a pain, several attacks, including physical ones that logically have no clear indication that they're piercing attacks, go through shields with no explanation, meaning blocking isn't always effective either. This includes their awful pounce attack that has far too short of a windup, knocks you down, and is a common response the man-eaters use when they're hit. This is a boss idea that can work, and works well in later titles in fact, but here, I mean, there's only so many times I can say that the main challenge comes from unintentional shortcomings of the mechanics rather than the mechanics themselves. Moving forward, Old Hero is supposed to be a delicate fight where you play carefully, since his only way of finding you is through sound. It's a great concept, so it makes sense that the punishments for mistakes here are huge, thanks to his high damage and stamina damage output. But even when wearing light equipment, it can be incredibly difficult to lose his attention after you hit him, meaning he feels kind of broken. Maybe I was doing something wrong, but I just couldn't figure out a way to lose him consistently. Put the Thieves' Ring on though, and the fight becomes so trivial that he likely won't hit you once, and might not even swing at you. Kind of an anticlimax. Meanwhile, the run-up to him is one of the worst in the game, because there are tons of long-range enemies of several types who each do tons of damage under the right circumstances and are often really difficult to avoid while you're doing other things. There are also a lot of traps. People are right when they say Shrine of Storms 2 is a shorter stage, but they're wrong when they argue this means it's okay that the entire level is the run-up to the boss. The level is only shorter than the others in terms of total exploration, but for the boss retries it becomes one of the longest and most tedious levels, because there are once again a ton of places to die instantly from one mistake, and no shortcuts. It's a run that can take between 5 to 20 minutes to do each time if you haven't absolutely mastered it and you're not perfectly avoiding every single enemy. So it sucks that you'll most often die in one hit due to an unlucky spell to the back, or another freaking cliff. One mistake death punishments are everywhere in Demon's Souls. Seriously. I can't even begin to count the areas where one mistake leads to such a huge punishment that death is guaranteed. Sometimes it's not even a mistake. Take the run-up to Old King Allant, the final boss. Again, no shortcuts, and the run consists of the entire level. This tower includes 2 Red-Eye Knights that can just barely clip you while you're running by, and if they do, it'll often one-shot you because it's a critical hit. They also block a staircase where you can only squeeze by if they move right toward the edge, otherwise you have to kill them both, as well as an assassin and 2 archers. If you fail to run by successfully, you're probably dead. Not something that should be left up to chance. And again, just because speedrunners may be able to consistently bait out things with really precise movements does not mean it's okay to say that newer players need to get good. Anyway, outside there's the Blue Dragon, who breathes fire on the bridge. Along with him are 2 fat officials. If you killed everything previous to this, you can let the dragon kill the first guard. If you didn't, you'd better run and hope the collision on the guards doesn't randomly get in your way, because once again, say it with me, the main challenge here isn't due to the mechanics, but rather unintentional quirks in the mechanical design. Yay! Even with the maximum fire resistance I could use on my character and my shield up, the fire shots dished out by the fat officials could nearly one-shot me, and the stagger from it is of course just enough so that you're all but guaranteed to either be hit by the same guard again, the other guard, or the dragon. Get past that, and the dragon goes up to the top of the succeeding staircase. Making it past this is freaking luck if you don't know exactly where to stand to bait out the proper attacks. Something that only comes from looking it up, or countless deaths due to experimentation. And again, if you get hit on your way up, you're done for. The boss ahead is no slouch either. It probably won't be uncommon for your first playthrough or two to be one-shot or comboed by him as soon as you start the fight. You can kill the Blue Dragon to make the run-up to the boss easier, but it takes upgrading a bow, being able to wield said bow, using hundreds of arrows until he flies up to the castle, getting past him at the staircase without dying, and at least 20 minutes of time. Spend the first 15 minutes moving him toward the staircase and die to his fire on the way back? Too bad. He's at full health and you have to do it all over again. It's not a fun or engaging boss run. It's either luck-based or tedious as shit, depending on how you try to tackle it. Yes, there is a consistent way to get past the Blue Dragon on the stairs, and yes, there are consistent ways to kill him, including skipping him at the bridge and then loosing all of your arrows on him once you safely get under him at the castle, which is the way I did it. But none of these choices are engaging and they're pretty obscure as well. To lock onto him, you have to sit in pretty specific spots. To avoid his attacks and bait out the right attacks, you have to stand in specific spots. Everything is so specific and restrictive. It's super risky at points and has aggravating punishments for failure. When the only consistent way to dodge the fire is to take deaths until you figure out the vague hitboxes on the alpha effects, that's not great design, period. Like many things, it works well online because you can see warning messages letting you know exactly which bits are safe. But the game can be played offline, so it should be designed to work offline without an external guide or mountains of tedium. Same with killing the dragon. It's not fair or fun to expect players to find just the right spot so they can lock onto his head and fire junk into it for 10 minutes. And no, telling other players to grab the optional Makoto sword, clever rat's ring, and the ring of magical sharpness for killing the dragon with spells does not make it fair design. That's a pretty meta decision only experienced players are ever likely to come to, and players shouldn't be forced to suddenly become a katana-wielding mage that lives on the edge just to tackle a challenge without the tedium. This is 110% not defendable design. The red dragon is a chore to kill as well. There's no engaging way to kill him either, but at least he's integrated into the second stage better. You have a genuine choice here. You can take the quicker but more dangerous route across the top of the bridge, where he breathes fire. Or you can take the slower and safer route inside the bridge. Both play fairly consistently. The stage doesn't force a luck-based gauntlet of insta-kill fire on you every time you want to run to the boss. You can choose to fight other enemies below instead. Back to the final stage in Boletaria though for a second. I'd like to point out that the elevator up to Old King Allant sucks, since the ride is legitimately like 20 seconds long. I ended up having to do several hours of grinding to get up to a level where I wasn't just doing chip damage to Allant, despite being at a decently respectable level when I first reached him anyway. He is defeatable as I was when I first got to him, but the risk of getting soul-sucked, which takes away a level from you, and, what do you know, it one-shot me every time, wasn't worth the time the battle would take versus the risk. After grinding about 20 levels, he soul-sucked me again, bringing me just under my needed equip burden, and ending in my death, so I grinded again. I finally beat him after that because I grinded enough that there was little to no way he could have done any major harm with the soul suck attack at that point. I don't mind the idea of the soul suck attack, but I feel it's an unjustified bit of cruelty when you factor in the fact that he's otherwise a pretty difficult boss anyway, especially for new players, and also the fact that dying on the way to him means you lose all the souls from the levels he sucked from you. This makes a cycle of required grinding quite a large possibility, and isn't helped by the fact that the frame rate can struggle when fighting him. Regardless of that, it's important for me to note that defeating Old King Allant for the first time all those years ago was the moment I'd realized that I'd actually gotten good at Souls. There's one more thing I wanted to touch on, which is that I think Demon's Souls hits a bit too hard in the punishments related to being in human form. Its successor, Dark Souls, is too lenient in this regard, because the only downside to being undead is that you lose the ability to summon. But you also can't be invaded, which is generally the more favorable position anyway, so in Dark Souls 1 there's not really enough reason to go into human form. Bloodborne is even more lenient because you can gain the ability to summon anywhere, meaning you don't even have to worry about being invaded. At least in DS1, you have to become human at a bonfire, meaning making it to summon spots and bosses requires risking invasion or wasting the humanity you just used if you die. Demon's Souls makes it so you can't summon in soul form as well. Most of the levels don't have super quick shortcuts either, meaning human form always carries a huge risk of wasting stones of ephemeral eyes due to the abundance of quick deaths, and the risk of invasion. When not in human form, you lose half of your maximum health. On top of that, Dying in human form pushes the world's world tendency toward black, giving enemies more health, stronger attacks, and spawning extra enemies like black phantoms. They also drop less healing items, so continually dying in human form means you're left with less chances to summon, your maximum health is cut in half, less healing items drop, and tougher enemies. The risk here is too high for anyone that isn't really experienced. And none of this is really explained that well in-game, meaning people can get themselves really deep into a hole. Dark Souls 2, I feel, struck the best balance with undead and human forms, because being undead prevents summoning, as usual, and slowly chips away at your max health with each death until you hit 50%. This actually makes human effigies more valuable than Stones of Ephemeral Eyes because their value is kept in check. When value for an item gets too high, it ironically eventually becomes less valuable. Think about it this way, if you bought a Ferrari tomorrow, you likely wouldn't drive it much because it's so rare and expensive, despite the fact that it only exists to be driven. It becomes so valuable that it effectively loses the only value it was designed to have. Same thing here. Since Stones of Ephemeral Eyes are so expensive and rare, this compounds on the other risks that come with using one and wasting it to make it no longer worth the risk to use at all. This means they're effectively useless to most players. Human effigies, likewise, maintain value because you haven't completely borked everything just because you use one and then die. You may not be able to summon anymore without using another, but you still have around 2 to 3 more runs of the tangible health boost it affords, which lessens the risk of using a single effigy and therefore makes them more useful as a whole. Demon's Souls was my first Souls game. And honestly, despite the overwhelming negativity here, I think it should be everyone's first Souls game. Demons excels at providing new, unique experiences even to this day. I agree wholeheartedly with Matthew Matosis in that Souls has become more refined, but also more safe and predictable with each iteration. A lot of what Demon's Souls tries to do doesn't work, but it still tried to do things that people at the time would have said could never work. And as such, it still remains unique even within its own series today. Starting your experience with the series by playing one of the later games will undoubtedly coddle players, making them accustomed to the more refined design and polish on display. In growing used to this, I think many players will struggle to see what makes Demon's Souls so special, because its lack of polish will stick out to a much greater degree. I think everyone should play Demon's Souls first, because despite all of its flaws, it embodies what made the series so popular in the first place, a willingness to take risks, and that's something that even for a Souls veteran like me who has played through Demon's Souls at least half a dozen times, gets much harder to appreciate once you've played the later titles. Demon's Souls doesn't hold up in a lot of ways. I wouldn't say it's awful, but I wouldn't say it's that good. But what it does well, that's worth experiencing with fresh eyes at least once, no matter what. At very least, so that you can understand why its legacy lives on in spite of its flaws. What do you guys think? Do you like Demon's Souls? Is there anything about it you think particularly stands out as good or bad? Do you think it holds up better than I do? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.